interpersonal communication, what you'll find is something like the exchange of information between two people. As I said in an earlier video, that's a bad definition of communication to start with. It asks the "did you get it" question, and it models a transmission model of communication, which is what we don't want to do. I'm going to give you a different definition of interpersonal communication to start with, and then a couple of general principles that we ought to follow if we're going to be better at interpersonal communication. Instead of saying that interpersonal communication is the exchange of information between two people, I like to say that it's a way of enacting relationality. And what that means is I'm asking, instead of "did you get it?" what kind of relationship is built, maintained, transformed, or enacted by this form of communication or this communicative act? I'm asking about relationships first and information not at all. So interpersonal communication is really a matter of building or maintaining relationships. It's using communicative practices to do that kind of work, not the work of exchanging information. So if I'm going to ask some other questions about interpersonal communication, they're going to be questions about relationality or about kinds of relationships. With that in mind, there's 5 basic principles or 5 basic sort of rules of thumb to follow if you're going to become better at interpersonal communication. 5 things to keep in mind. First is that you cannot not communicate. Even the attempt to not communicate communicates meaning in an interpersonal setting. By that I mean if your friend asks you a question and you sit there in stony silence, pretending not to understand or hear the question, you're still communicating something to that other friend because you're enacting a relationship between you and the friend, even though no information is being exchanged. Our very position in the world means that we are constantly communicating to others through that positionality. So there's no not communicating in interpersonal settings. Second, interpersonal communication is multimodal. That means that words are not the only instruments of interpersonal communication. In fact, tone, touch, and gesture are the 3 other main modes of interpersonal communication, and we'll see those in more specific detail in subsequent videos. Tone, touch, and gesture actually carry more communicative weight in interpersonal settings sometimes than words do. So you can't not communicate. Interpersonal communication is multimodal. Third, it's also irreversible. You can never take back something you have said or done because you cannot undo an effect. So if you can't undo an effect, the effect is irreversible and remains. Every interpersonal relationship experiences this at some point. A communicative act is irreversible. Fourth, interpersonal communication is complex. Because it involves another person with their own thoughts, feelings, and biography, and the other person will largely determine the success or failure of your communication practices, then you're constantly in a position of communicating imperfectly or with incomplete knowledge. That means that even interpersonal communication fails more often than it succeeds. You don't enact the kind of relationship you want because it's so complex. And fifth, interpersonal communication is contextual. Psychological, situational, environmental, and cultural context informs the meaning of words, gestures, tone, and touch. These contexts can determine the effects of a communicative act just as much as the content of that communicative act. So we can keep those 5 things in mind as we proceed through the rest of the videos here. They'll inform the specific communication practices we're going to talk about. So in interpersonal communication, you can't not communicate. It's multimodal, it's irreversible, it's complex, and it's contextual.